In those early years, it was sort of like there's nothing we can't solve together. And the bedrock of that is people. And also that I think that you see the shift in that language now today and the values because waves of layoffs, the threat of, AI replacing jobs. No one is saying from Google anymore that people are the heart of what we do. If anything, it's sort of like prove that you're better than AI. It's just like all these companies constantly threatening redundancy to their to their coders now. Things have really changed.
This is a show about the future of tech and the future of work. I'm Jeff Nielsen, and today I'm talking with the author of Don't Be Evil, Claire Stapleton. A 12-year vet at Google, Claire went from being a leader of communications to an organizer of the Google walkouts to leaving the organization completely, not without acrimony. Claire had a front row seat to what she called a loss of a moral compass in big tech, and is telling the story in her new book. If Google were the only company in the world to be accused of losing its moral compass, I wouldn't be all that interested. But virtually every organization I've ever worked with has had some version of this battle, with their employees being somewhere between frustrated to disheartened to completely checked out. Few of us have fought the good fight as courageously as Claire, so I want to know what we can learn from her. Should we expect our employers to act morally? What can we do if we're seeing bad behavior? And how can we be a force for good and build organizations that aren't evil? Let's find out. Claire, thanks so much for joining today. Super excited to have you. I wanted to, I guess, maybe start at the beginning. So, you were at Google an awfully long time. I think something like 12 years. And at the beginning, to me, it's very much a story of you very much being Team Google. Card carrying, flag waving, member of Team Google. And, the story kind of goes downhill from there. So I'm curious from your perspective to hear you tell it, like, what happened?
Yeah. I mean, that really is the entire arc of the book. I was hired straight out of college through college recruiting, which is a very rare window of time that they actually did that at the company. I had a huge hiring burst around 2007 when I was graduating from college. And I was an English major and I got a job in the communications department, which seemed like, okay, this is a good kind of corporate job if you're a kind of humanities student. And I wasn't even particularly interested in technology, but it was impossible to not be sort of drawn into the lore around the company at that particular moment. They were on the cover of, Fortune Best Places to Work. And, there were all of this, coverage of the kind of lavish perks of the campus. And the basic brief of the job was like to become a corporate storyteller. So it's sort of like, where did my, genuine idealism and enthusiasm begin and the kind of requirements of the job end? Because it was sort of like they wanted enthusiasm, they wanted idealism, they wanted people who could be kind of passionate spokespeople for the company. And I thought, hey, I can do that. And, it was going from college into this environment, it was quite intoxicating because you're kind of being pumped with this rhetoric about how special you are. I mean, there's, from the first day of orientation, they're saying, we get 3,000 applications a minute or, something. I don't know the exact stat, but something kind of like hyperbolic and you're the chosen one. And this is the golden ticket. Particularly as the, job market has like ebbed and flowed and the, .com industry has gone through so many different iterations. It did feel like, wow, we got the kind of like, catbird seat here for this like, amazing era of technology that's dawning. I think that, sort of inherent to my role was a sense of the mission and the purpose of the company. So I think that now everyone sort of agrees that these big tech companies are very kind of complicated institutional figures in our, governing our society, and they feel more nefarious. But if you kind of put yourself back in 2007, the this is right before Obama was elected. It was like this moment of kind of like American optimism. And tech companies were right, particularly companies like Google, were these like amazing American stories that two guys in a garage, two geeky geniuses are going to come through and kind of solve all the world's problems. So as I was going back and writing the book, I was really interested to kind of to track how the rhetoric of the company kind of really thickened and evolved, and the company culture was a really big part of that. It was a big part of what the company was sort of exporting. And anyway, so I spent a few years in Mountain View working closely with the founders and a bunch of other executives. On the whole, a great experience. And I sort of wanted to try something else, got a transfer to the New York office. And then that next 7 years, I guess, tracks kind of slow and then fast disillusionment arc where, I had a really difficult time in just a kind of normal, difficult, toxic work experience. Still kind of caught in the lore and mythology of the company because I was working at this in-house creative agency called Creative Lab. Um, was a really tough experience. But then I moved over to YouTube marketing. YouTube was like hotter than hot. This is in the sort of like mid aughts, but was coming kind of complex and was a really interesting place to work. Also, we were continuing to kind of like cheerlead about it and disseminate the values of the company as a communications marketing person. And then, I had a kid. I was starting to see things in a kind of like a bit different way. And then Donald Trump was elected. There was a whole kind of uproar at the company around a big scandal, a New York Times story about executive payouts for sexual harassment. Anyway, I ended up getting into labor organizing and organized the Google walkout along with a great group of women. And you can imagine my Google career didn't last much longer after that. Yeah. So
It's
that's the basic gist of the book.
it's really interesting. I mean, it's a crazy story with, so many chapters, and it's funny. I mean, you kind of laid it out, but it feels like it's almost an arc of American history, and like to go back to the period of the mid aughts. There's this sense that you're talking about Google, and I remember the period where they seem to have this vision of like this forward-looking, very modern company that had these values that transcended what you would typically expect from a corporation. And, that I think is some of the idealism you were talking about. Can you add a little bit more color to that? Like, what was the culture? What were some of those values that they were espousing that felt so intoxicating? And did you find they were actually living it at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I used to give the tours of the campus, and the office design was really a bedrock of it because everything in that moment was a feverish rush to capture talent. So, I'm like a comms person. As people come in as community or as customer service reps or something, it's sort of like a service person, but everything was about serving engineers and rock star product talent. So, they had people very thoughtfully design offices that would engineer collaboration. And that was the idea of the lunch table, and people stick around for lunch. They're not wasting this time. Sure, it's a sort of a productivity move as well. But the office design was very open and flat to reflect that good ideas come from anywhere. And, anyone can come in and, build the next Gmail or whatever it was. So I think that the culture was also very much about employee voice. And I worked on this weekly meeting, TGIF, hosted by the founders, where yes, there'd be some sort of presentation and they talk about the product updates of the week, but most of it was a Q&A with employees. And I think it was um, it felt sort of radical at the time because people would line up and come with their questions, and oftentimes the questions were very pointed or kind of critical about strategic direction or a misstep, and it was there was this sense that the executives are so accessible and they're like peers, and maybe they'd even course correct. So I think that there's that where they really wanted to empower the employees because they felt like that's how they do their best work. And I think that when Larry Page kind of cycled in and out of being the CEO over the sort of early period of time, his second stint at this was when I was in the comms department. He really believed that you need to get the employees hopped up on the mission and the world changing aspects of the company. And that's what I think was like almost the most bittersweet or sort of somber note for me, is that when I was looking back at everything he said in this sort of like 2011 period, was that, you know, Google could cure death because we're so ambitious in our scope. We have all these talented people. We have all these resources. We're faster than the bureaucracy of the state. We're not encumbered by, the complexity, which isn't true. I mean, the company was pretty complex already, but, we can dramatically solve humanity's problems. And when you really look at it, I'm like, it's not to say that Google hasn't, transformed the world in certain ways, but if you look at, you know, search and YouTube and all these other things, it's like, in a way, I think that you know, tech has sort of really contributed to the challenging, polarized, unequal environment, that we now look at society and think like, are things any better than 10 years ago? Certainly feels worse in a lot of ways for a lot of people. While extreme wealth has gotten, concentrated sort of at the top of the company. So anyway, but in those early years, it was sort of like, there's nothing we can't solve together. And, at the bedrock of that is people. And also that I think that you see the shift in that language now today and the values because, waves of layoffs, the threat of, AI replacing jobs. No one is saying from Google anymore that people are the heart of what we do. If anything, it's sort of like prove that you're better than AI. It's just like all these companies, constantly threatening redundancy to their to their coders now. Things have really changed, but I think that at the time, the kind of I don't think it was insincere. I think that Larry and Sergey really did feel that Google can have this transformative impact on society, not just to like create online ads, but that it's this much more sweeping contribution to the world that I don't know. People can assess whether that's been borne out, and I would say it hasn't.
If you don't work in enterprise technology, you can skip ahead or take a quick braincation. But if you do, Infotech is your secret weapon. Infotech helps IT teams get projects done faster, better, and at a lower cost. Whether you're rolling out new tech, improving processes, or just looking for cost savings, Infotech provides unlimited access to practical tools and expert guidance you need to execute at a fraction of the cost of traditional consulting. No matter the project, from AI strategy to cybersecurity to vendor negotiation, Infotech has you covered. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. So I'm really curious, and I find it so interesting. You talked to us a little bit about, I guess, what happened to Claire in that time and what happened to America in that time. I'm still trying to sort out in my mind, like, what happened to Google? There's this age of almost like mythologizing and this mission that, as you said, it seems like it was sincere coming from Larry and Sergey. Is it that they stepped back? Is it the company got too big? Like, what happened to
Yeah.
Google that's led to this slide? Do you have any like reflections on that?
Well, I do because, what Larry Page, this very brief period of time where he was the CEO, he gave a few interviews. He has like vocal paralysis. So it's sort of like he never really spoke in public the same way after this like 1 year. But he talked about how he was studying why companies fail, or as a counterpoint, why companies become so big and bloated and sclerotic that they stop innovating on the same level. And that's like such a kiss of death. And, I think that he understood the risk of becoming, super corporate. And ultimately, it seems like that's completely played out. I think that, my vantage point being in the communications department was that the company went from this period of rapid growth and just, making tons of money and doing all these different things. And it was, so cool and so exciting. But then, contrary to their own kind of, values on paper about HR, they ended up hiring a ton of executives or elevating people to kind of, manage these different sort of business units, these different little fiefdoms. I think that this age of executives became a really complicated situation for the company because it corporatized it in a big way, because all of a sudden you have people coming from the outside that are kind of, there's people from Microsoft or, people who are kind of used to competently running, really big teams, really big orgs, who might not, believe in that same sort of like freewheeling spirit, but they have a different skill set or something like that. The communications became more formal. The amount of trust that you can have in the company, the transparency isn't the same because people's stake feels, more tenuous. Yeah, I think that, the company has been plagued by sort of lack of sort of central organization. So I have an example in the book that there were like 5 different teams working on smartwatches at the same time. Like, that's not only kind of demoralizing, but it's inefficient. And they've had, many waves of Ruth Porat is the CFO. When they brought her in, they called her Ruthless Ruth because she was trying to look and see where all the bloat and the waste was coming from. So I could see that as Google moved into kind of first this age of executives, then this age of branding where they just put tons of money into marketing, and it was $1 billion budgets for the marketing department. And then on a much kind of smaller scale note, in my last few years at YouTube, I saw this. My dad was a small business owner in Emeryville, California, in the Bay Area where I grew up. And I would tell him sometimes the anecdotes about my manager, who's someone who's been very successful at Google, and she's like a mid-level executive, and then the marketing department's still there. And I remember we were talking about doing an event to promote some YouTube show we were working on, and um, you know, I think I was trying to do some cost saving, or even saying I don't know if we even need to do an event, if we're going to see the ROI from that. And she was basically encouraging me to continue to on with this event and to spend the maximum, was allotted for it. And she said, and I'll never forget it, you don't get a gold star for coming in under budget. And the logic there was, if you don't spend, then you can't ask for, you need to ask for bigger budgets, year in, year out. And so what you have with someone like that, and I think there's tons of people like this, is people who are really savvy corporate game players, and their priority isn't the mission of the company and the end user and all these other kind of idealistic things that we kind of, we're always talking about obsessively in the early days. Her interest is growing her influence in the org, growing her budget, growing her headcount. She's probably, self-interested monetarily to, get it. And I think, with culture shift, organizational culture is organizational psychology is so complicated, but I could see that very unfortunately, Google had sort of lost its grip on, people who were deeply invested in the company's success, and instead more invested in their success. I'm sure, as Larry Page would say, this is an inevitability that you have to fight aggressively as companies become so big. And also the mission of the company is so big and so complicated. And when I joined the YouTube marketing team, and I would tell my husband, who's an architect, about my job, it was like, Google had also undergone, kind of related to what I'm talking about, the old manager, this bullshit jobsification, where I would describe what I'm doing. Okay, I run a team that manages the social media presence for YouTube. And, it's not really tied to any particular goal. It's like, we're just supposed to kind of drive positive sentiment. And, he's not like an architect, you're building houses sort of like brick by brick. It's very tangible. And he'd be like, I just don't really kind of understand how this connects to like YouTube's bottom line or any particular goal, because our goals would kind of change. It's sort of like, we're going with the wind. And there's, a lot of discussion in the book about, how the social media channels change with the political climate. And now we're doing liberal values. Now we're not, this sort of thing. And, but yet, like, he would say that and I'd be like, it's so true. Like, what even is this job? And yet the budgets and the headcounts, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. We had, multiple agencies, tons of people. I mean, my boss, had probably had 30 people on her team by the end. She was the person overseeing the social media presence. So you think, all right, I've seen YouTube's Twitter account or Instagram account or something. Think about that. 30 people and then maybe 100 other people out of these agencies who are working on it. It's just tremendously wasteful. It's it's really hard from the outside perspective to understand how the company could justify that kind of money. And it's like a jobs program. It's like it's like some sort of like a big socialist project, but it's within the under the guise of big corporate company. So anyway, I think there's a lot of reasons why the culture has shifted in ways that make it like a bit less desirable in every way, but it's been so quick.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because it seems like it's so obviously underwent like a metamorphosis, and it feels like it's not unique to Google either, right? That there's all these stories of, you have companies that get too big and suddenly they have money and they don't know what to do with it, and they do weird stuff and they get corporatized, and you have, it starts as being very people focused, and you have, someone like Larry who's making sure that it reflects their values. And then, as they step back a little bit, you lose that North Star. So yeah, it's interesting. And I want to talk more about that through our conversation. But I guess just kind of playing the tape forward, we end up a handful of years later with the walkouts and the events leading up to the walkouts. And for, listeners who don't know, that involves some fairly egregious sexual harassment payouts. But maybe, Claire, you can tell us a little bit about the lead up to it and the walkouts themselves, and like how you got involved with that.
Right. I know. It's supposed, to have considered myself kind of the ultimate corporate good girl, and then to be, leading the charge on this sort of revolt was definitely a shocking turn. Even though I lived it, I'm like, how did I end up doing that? I think that again, the kind of cultural context drives so many, forces and, rupture moments, right? So, Trump had come into power in 2016, and so there were a lot of conversation. The Me Too movement. It was 2018 began, and there was a lot of women feeling that there was space available to talk about kind of some of the you know systemic cultural aspects of the way the workplaces we've been in, um, and just the patriarchy in general, right? So um, I I had a baby, which was just personally a very radical experience, as it can be. And while I was on maternity leave, there was this sort of Me Too stuff kind of came home to roost at Google, because there was an engineer named James Damore who sent around a memo. There's a lots of mailing lists and people, kind of constantly arguing things at Google. It was a big part of the culture. I don't think is, but he, there was a mailing list that was for controversial takes, and he wrote a big memo, um, basically about how women are biologically less suited to engineering than men, and it's actually been a huge disaster. The DEI, efforts that Google had done to try to bring more women onto engineering teams was counterproductive and a huge disaster. All these other things. So I was sort of just like watching this with fascination, because it unearthed this conversation about the lingering bro culture in the Valley, which I think that in some ways was sort of hard to see. It's not like being in Wall Street where someone's like slapping your butt or something, like in the 80s. I think that the kind of hacker bro culture of the Valley has always been there. And there's a good Emily Chang book called Brotopia, which talks a little bit about the sort of like startup culture and sexism, kind of basic sexism, I guess. But it ended up being this sort of interesting moment where I think women were starting to chew on feeling that sort of sense of discrimination, or sense of like, I'm a DEI hire and all this, and it was really interesting. So then, Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court that fall that I was coming back from maternity leave, and was also another really interesting moment of just talking about patriarchy and sort of, it was just a really interesting, meaty cultural conversation. So the women at Google, I think, were engaged in a way that, because usually as a Googler, you're like, I'm so grateful and happy to be here. I'm like, making good money, and what a wonderful company. And, they support, the whole person and all that. Right. So it's really hard, because I think there's a lot of sense of like, who are you to, people are getting like raped around, like there's so much like there's, women face, or in people of color face, you know, so much, there's so many difficult, experiences around the world. We're so privileged. How could we possibly complain? It's sort of, a little bit the attitude of women at Google, I think. But all this is to say, there was a big New York Times expose of a man named Andy Rubin, who we all knew well as like a really big, basically like second only to Larry and Sergey as a kind of celebrity of the company. And he had been investigated for, improper relations with subordinates on the team, I guess you could say. There's sort of like some very salacious details, and inappropriate. It was largely like very inappropriate behavior for someone running a team and running a huge org. And Google had investigated these claims and basically decided to get him out of the company. But he got a $90 million payout. So of course, this is probably was like, he created Android. So it's probably like contractual, like they get paying him some percentage of what Android was worth, and all this. But there were a few other examples in this New York Times story, including of David Drummond, who was the chief legal officer, actually having a baby with someone who was like on his administrative team. And she was sort of shuttled out of the company with nothing. And, anyway, so it created the perfect, image in an already charged time for women at the company, that look at the optics here, that, a man abuses his power, gets a hero's farewell, gets, Andy Rubin was getting paid like, $2 million a month for however many years or whatever, some crazy thing. And, and meanwhile, these women who are kind of like discarded by the side of the road, who are, the victims of these sort of like men in power. And I think it summed up. It was like the match that lit the powder keg sort of moment. So since coming back from maternity leave, I love a listserv. So I was, big on the moms group, it was an anonymous group, but I was just really interested to see people's reactions to this. And I think people were kind of chiming in with their sort of like Me Too stories, and people started to talk about, what we might do, send a letter to the CEO. Maybe we should all get together and go to the TGIF and, show a united front about, how angry we are. And I think because I've been so deep in the bones of the internal communications, and knew how insufficient they were for accountability at that point in the company's lifespan, as well as just like the moment, it's like, it just felt like we should do something something bigger to log and register our discontent, maybe something public facing. We're going to walk out. And so I think that it was like, I had just hit this point of being sort of like personally and professionally frustrated and kind of fed up with aspects of my management and the way I'd been treated after maternity leave and all these other things. And I just thought, I have good name recognition within the company from my days in communications. I'm happy. I'm never going to get fired or dinged for this. And I think that it's about time that, make a statement to management about how this isn't okay. These systemic issues are not okay. So I just sort of said, I can help put my name on it and plan it. Some wonderful people came to the fold, and we had this, whole group that was working on it. And we thought we'd be at a couple hundred people, maybe in Mountain View, maybe in New York. But one really kind of sobering aspect of it was that it seemed to take off so quickly. We planned it within a week, and then the protest happened. And I was like, what is happening here? Because I know, some women are frustrated, and, there's women who've, experienced really bad things, way worse than what I'm talking about with, my own feeling of like opportunity discrimination or whatever. And I sent out a Google form saying, why are you walking out? Why are you compelled to, kind of step out of line? We're all kind of like good girls, like high achievers here at Google. And I got 350 stories back, or 350 responses back. And a lot of them were these egregious stories of just like, I just said that, like, oh, we think we're so privileged, no one's like slapping our butt like they would on Wall Street or something. There's tons of that. There's tons of, inappropriate remarks, just, casual sexism, horrible experiences people had, coming back from maternity leave, having their products given away, these things that you'd think there'd be not just, the basic labor protections that you didn't get treated this way at work just because of your gender or the color of your skin. But especially at Google, which, foisted by its own petard here, always said it was like the kind of progressive workplace of the future that, we treat people, kind of better than, workers are the center of, and the lifeblood of this place. And we wouldn't want, all these sort of like HR checks and balances to kind of, theoretically prevent people from feeling like things are completely, unfair, sexist, racist, and all this. And so I was really shocked that like under the cover of darkness, there was still so much of this going on. Google's response was also kind of interesting and telling, where, the head of HR was like, yep, it's inevitable. You have a company of 90,000 people. There's going to be like sexual harassment. Just didn't meet the moment, and it kind of like continued to, what was, this kind of pure expression of just anger and rage in that moment became quickly a kind of operation to kind of continue to push the company to make changes in these ways. We had demands, we kind of were, following up on them. And Google was like, okay, you blew off steam. We're good. Let's move on here. We got it. Don't call us. We'll call you. And yeah, so yeah, they ended up, not loving the ongoing organizing at the time. Yeah. And they clamped down on it really hard. So that's, yeah.
Well, tell me about the clampdown, because, from my very distant point of view, what I saw was like the sort of tacit leadership, like, oh yes, we support you, but please go away, or something like that. Like, it was like, it seemed like it was like head nodding, but
Yeah.
like whatever the opposite of commitment to action is. Like basically, yes, we hear you, but we're not willing to make any sort of system level changes. So tell me about the clampdown, and tell me what happened next from your perspective.
Well, just to first mention that the company initially took a "if you can't beat them, join them" sort of attitude. So when the walkout was getting planned, the CEO of the company sent out an email saying, "I understand this is happening, and you're welcome to walk out." It was just so weird, but it was good publicity for the
Hmm.
event, I guess. Um, and then the CFO of the company was at a Wall Street Journal conference that week, and she was like, "I walked out myself, and this is here we have Googlers doing what Googlers do well. We're going to solve all these problems together, and like sexual harassment, yet another problem that Google can solve. Which is crazy. But so it was sort of like hunky dory, and as an organizer, I was invited to go do a meeting with the top female executives like Susan Wojcicki and Ruth, the CFO, and um, you know, but the coziness was, it dissipated almost immediately. They did an all hands where they said, here's our, kind of like internal site where we're going to like, make progress on these demands, but they never commit, other than they got rid of forced arbitration, which was a big deal. They didn't really do any of the things, but some of the things we were demanding were quite like existential in nature, like commit to like correcting pay inequity and things like this. But it was a lot of lip service, I think. Though what really kind of amplified the walkout was that there was a big shareholder lawsuit, which said that the way that Google had handled these high profile cases was doing damage to the company, and so there was a big settlement with the women of the company. However, the uh, the company made very quick work to it my belief isolate the women who were working on this stuff um, within their teams. In my case, feel very much that I was sort of like pushed off of my team, but at the same time, they made internal policy changes, including talk about a shift from the open, transparent Google culture. They very quickly sent around an email saying that now there are penalties for accessing need to know documents if you don't have if you aren't supposed to be looking at these things, which is was sort of like ambiguous. How would you know what? Because the company was like all documents were publicly viewable by default, and all these other things that were kind of hallmarks of the culture. They ended up firing a group of people after I had already left, but someone was just for looking on calendars. This guy had looked on HR calendars and spotted that someone in HR was meeting with this kind of famous union busting firm, and people were getting a hold of documents that showed that Google was basically kind of trying to run a psychological operation to quell the threat of organizing, quell the threat of unionism, and yeah. So I think that, and it, when people get fired for stuff that's confusing like that, which is, what it was very, there was someone who also put like a pop-up on all Linux machines that said like organizing is a protected right, these things. That person got fired. So basically, that's very chilling. I mean, the chilling effects of that, it's a complete about face from we have Googlers doing what Googlers do well, all the way to yeah, you saw something on a calendar, we don't like that, you're gone. So, and yeah, there, I think that and then that the shot chaser there was that the tech industry started doing layoffs. So, you know, the walkout was born of a time where workers did feel, ironically enough, psychologically safe. Here's me saying, I've been at this company forever. They're never gonna get rid of me for this, because I'm holding Google to its own stated values. So even if they don't like that this is a protest, it's sort of bad PR for it's drawing more attention to this sort of like corporate malfeasance. Um, Even so, they're going to have to live with that, because the culture is durable enough to absorb these voices, and all the company's not so insecure that they would punish people for speaking out against things that they deserve to be held accountable for. But how wrong I was, because I think that, even though I think that pretty much all the women from the walkout um, left like pretty dramatically and in public ways, and I thought that if anything, the optics of that will look so bad for this company that I know cares so much about being seen as inclusive and progressive. But anyway, they still did. And like when I was kind of finishing up the book last summer, I went and saw that the women who were the head of my department, marketing, and at YouTube as well, ended up going on kind of like a roadshow and putting out op-eds the year or two after I left, and all this sort of fracas at Google about, pontificating about how to build diverse and inclusive teams that, like help people flourish. I'm just like, can nobody see this through this ridiculousness that they, ended up kind of, that's not the biggest selling point for your inclusive team, that you ended up pushing out the people that dared to question leadership, particularly when we were hired on the back of that sort of promise. But yeah, that was the kind of like quick shift that they were able to make, and the chilling effects remain. I don't think that organizing exists at these tech companies near on the level of the kind of promise of that particular moment.
When I hear you talk about that period of time and about the walkouts, it's interesting, Claire, and tell me if you disagree, but I sense like a sense of reflection in you. Like it seems like you're like, oh, how idealistic I was, and what a time that was that things like that were happening. And I'm curious, you know, having had the chance now to sort of reflect on it, what you make of it now. Would you do it again? Would you have done something differently? Do you see it as, being a force for good, or just more of a product of its time?
Well, I think that, uh, you know, my naivete at that time was is something that I like feel like is very precious, because like even when I started experiencing the sort of like changing in my roles and responsibilities, and I'm starting to kind of get isolated from the main work that I'd been doing, um I was like, "Oh, surely if I go to HR, they'll fix this." I mean, it's crazy because I was surrounded by people who either were more kind of savvy labor organizers, or people who were just never had the same trust in authority that I did, or the kind of deference to authority. They think that, and I like, it may surprise people reading the book that I actually spent a bit of time talking about how I was formed, such that going to Google, I got so bought in. I was kind of interested to kind of like lightly psychoanalyze, like, went to Catholic school. I, was a good student, all these sort of like basic things that make someone, perhaps you could say the word susceptible to getting kind of drawn in to the kind of like the corporate BS, or whatever. Or get drawn into the story and not necessarily be able to separate, okay, I have here my values here and my sense of judgment. I'm just going to versus I'll just trust what leadership says. Um, so yeah, I think that I completely understand the person that I was, as I was like kind of like starting to have this awakening and like a new kind of like righteousness, and it feels to me very pure. Like it was like, it just was honestly like there was this zeitgeist moment, and I was feeling kind of passionate and hot, so it was sort of like that just happened. I think that yeah, whereas I think that a lot of the other organizers would be like, you need to like do complete, operation security, and like get a separate phone, and you can't use any Google products for things and all this other stuff. That I was just like, again, I was like, Google's never going to like punish us for this. Right. What I do, I think that, now knowing what I know, that, people who strive to make change, it usually doesn't go well for them, right? In a short-term way. It's not like you can necessarily say, "Oh, Google walkout like transform Google and their sexism is gone," or something. Or Google's like never going to have executives who abuse power. I mean, you know, that said, I think it was part of this bigger cultural moment, but it also catalyzed a conversation, I think, within people very much like an older version of myself, where, someone it was out in plain air. What's the delta between how Google describes itself and these sort of like values on paper, and how a big company that's a big kind of machine, it's the system and how it actually operates, and the kind of humanity and authenticity. And, I think it's tremendously healthy for people to like not be so obsessed with their company is like going to change the world and it's a unicorn magical place, like all this other stuff, that whether or not I was completely sold in on that, that was more the direction that I was in. I think that, it was a really powerful moment for me to kind of like learn and grow. And it was so shocking to be like kind of pushed out the company on the other end. And I'm just like, oh my God. Cause at the end of the book, like pregnant, and I'm like, it was a really kind of weird situation for me to be like, wait a minute, like, how did that like just go so spectacularly wrong? But, I think that the kind of silver lining of it is that, it forced me to kind of have a bit more agency over my own life. It's a little bit the message of the book that, you know, you know, buyer beware. If you wholesale import a corporation's worldview and, kind of hitch your wagon, I guess, for a lack of a better way to put it, if you hitch your wagon so hard to one place, I feel like there were many times where I might have left Google in the book because I was sort of like so unhappy or, dissatisfied, bored, whatever. But it was like unfathomable because my identity, for various reasons, had become so fused with the company. And then, we kind of broke up. Me, like, someone said, a friend who left Google was saying that after they left Google, were served a Spotify playlist about breakups. And they were like, as I'm listening to it, I'm like, why is this reminding me of Google? It's like not every workplace, kind of sets its teeth in emotionally, psychologically, whatever. But I think that, and I don't even know if Google is capable of doing that anymore. I'm sure people are like Anthropic or something, these other companies, like people probably having that kind of like culty family feeling still exists, in tech. It's very much how they do it. But, I think there's more skepticism and whatever with some of these big companies. But all this is to say, it's such an emotional job. And I think I came to realize that, it's much healthier, more interesting, you can have a richer life, if you're not so like fused with your kind of like institutional workplace. So yeah, like I've definitely had that, because I left in 2019. So it was like COVID. I had this like other kid and my life just like changed so much. I kind of like became a sort of part-time worker, stay-at-home mom for a few years and all this. And, it was really hard because I was like, wow, when you're like in charge of your time and, you have to kind of go and figure out what to do and how to make money and all those things. It's like, it's so much easier to just be kind of like on the train. Right. But ultimately it was a really kind of profound and healthy shift for me in my life. So yeah, there's things that I think that definitely when I look back at, how I kind of like escalated the retaliation and all these things like um, it, you know, I think I still see how much I kind of believed that the system would like make it right. And it kind of just kept deteriorating. I wonder if that's sort of like by design that like the more you kind of like, because my boss, who I was accusing of retaliation, started to be like, you're making things really hard for me. Like it's really hurtful for me that you're like making these claims, which is like crazy. It's like it it was so emotional, but it was totally gaslighting. But I was like, it was so stressful. I think that's, I wonder if I might have approached it, um, just purely from a legal standpoint or something, like I'm like, okay, this is wrong. So I'm just going to take this to the lawyer as opposed to what I tried to do, which was spend that last bit of belief, and capital in the company to go through this HR process, which is so crazy and so full of these moments where they're like suggesting I take a medical leave. The first HR person I talked to told me I should like, propose taking my manager out of the office for like an activity or coffee or something. I'm just like, it's the gaslighting of just like pushing it back down to the person created a few months that, I still feel like for my younger kid, I'm like, I was so stressed out during pregnancy with you, but he's pretty chill. So, but yeah, I think I made my life a little harder with my last gasp of like believing Google would make it right. But, for the most part, I feel also that, speaking out so much about just the kind of like disingenuous two-faced nature of a corporation or Google in particular. It's like I've had such an interesting inbound of like the of just other people commiserating. People like I remember this email I got from someone who was like, I was at IBM in Romania in the 1980s and like they made my life hell. And I'm just like, it's like everybody, I think a lot of different people can relate to feeling so small. And if you have it really comes down to like obviously this is a really big conflict with the company, but you could read my story as this sort of like a management tragedy, sort of like the manager exerting this power, reinforcing the powerlessness of the employee, the kind of cautionary tale of that. And I'd be really curious if that manager, I'm sure she would never admit weakness or reflect here, but if she feels like it could have been handled any differently, if that situation could have been mediated, so it wasn't, kind of so dramatic as it was, but, yeah, so it was a great learning experience. And at this point, as I sort of like processed the trauma of it, I'm like, yeah, well, it is what it is. It was the fire that tempered the steel. My like crazy trajectory at Google.
That's the spirit. I like that. I like that analogy and that sentiment of tempering. Um, so Claire, to me, like the most interesting part of all of this is, you had such a unique front row seat to this, but the experience itself of becoming disillusioned with your employer, with believing that they should be operating within a certain values framework, that they have your back, that they're going to adhere to some, I don't know, some sort of moral foundation that's better than like a cost benefit analysis or like the bare
Yeah.
minimum. And then watching that fall apart and just feeling like, should I speak up? Should I do the courageous thing? Am I going to get punished if I do the courageous thing? Like, I feel extremely confident that there are literally millions of people in some version of that, that plight right now. What's
Yeah.
what's your advice to them? Like, what's your advice to your younger self? What's your advice to somebody who's in this scenario and doesn't know what to do?
I think you have to be sort of clear-eyed about the risks. And in organizing, there's a lot of conversation about the spectrum of risk tolerance. And there were people that were deeply passionate about certain ethical issues within the company. It was personal for them. But they wanted to remain anonymous because they're, sending money home to their family, or, these things were like, it's completely fair to want to keep your job. And that's, a risk that not everyone's going to want to take. I think that, you know, my advice to people usually is to find a job where, you don't feel like you're so compromised that it's sort of like you're the manager, the nature of the work, the skills that you bring to the job, that there's something sort of like, something you can sink your teeth into, maybe not have to, tack some, kind of big ideological framework that you're changing the world, or so the grandiosity that I saw at Google. But um, I think that there's so many small ways that you can make a better world. I mean, honestly, it's like, I think that, some of the stuff I look back on in my career as I became a manager was, you sit in the performance reviews and you understand all the kind of like implicit bias that comes in, all the very subjective ways people's value is measured. And, it replicates, really kind of like complicated human systems. I think that there's a way to kind of like speak up for other people and like use a little bit of your privilege without, kind of blowing your wad like me and, getting fired or whatever. But, yeah, I think that like cultivating a mind where you can observe, what the company's doing, stay in touch with your own kind of values. And I think that, as I've seen along the way, people reach a point where they just get fed up with it. And then you either, you know, try to commit to to make your dissent known. And I remember I so admired in my old department, which didn't really welcome people challenging authority the way that it was in sort of Google in the old days, but people who would ask challenging questions. And I think that it can't be all people who are like perfectly compliant. It's like there's I think there's kind of sophisticated ways that people can maintain their own humanity, try to check the balances of power, maybe in small ways in their teams or in bigger ways in this sort of like organizing efforts, as well as, but like being aware of your privilege and being prepared to spend a little bit of it is like how kind of like slow ruptures and changes happen over time. I think people are offered opportunities to make small changes in a lot of different ways. And I've also seen, what kind of disappoints me is I see a lot of people put their head in the sand, when they certainly, like even like there are a couple people that were kind of close colleagues of mine, and they, when I left, they never said anything, or, it's like, and sometimes like if those people now, years later, they'll be like, commenting on like an Instagram story of mine or something, or like just some minor thing, right? A minor touch point. A couple of these people in the writing of the book, I actually responded to them to say, I'm curious what happened when I left and you saw your friend from work go through this like crazy traumatic rupture, and kind of like this like was awful, is like the heads of my department were like, Claire's a liar, she's making up this whole thing. I mean, it was like kind of crazy situation. And I had this one of these conversations. Someone said to me, I was basically like too chicken. Like I felt that management was saying one thing, and to like even express support to you privately was something that I didn't feel comfortable with at the time. And I'm just like, don't be that person. Like, I just can't imagine, like, I personally can't imagine being like, I need to now be like so in my box of like the management line that when I see something that's so clearly wrong, that, I couldn't like, reach out to my friend or whatever. So I feel like, having a little bit of courage, a little bit of moral outrage is a really important thing to like maintain in a world where, things are so complicated and we do feel so small, and, the kind of ripple effect that can exist. And I think that, but the kind of good thing now is, as opposed to in 2007, where it would have been really weird if you were like saying, oh, Google's this like evil company or whatever. Now there's so much more awareness of the, complex influence that tech is having on our lives. And a lot of people are reading nefarious influence and or, crazy kind of like capitalistic, goals, having like these companies in a chokehold such that like who cares about what their values are on paper, they're just soulless or whatever. So all this is to say there's these little kind of cracks here where people are freer to think more freely and not be so like, what management says is true or whatever. So, yeah.
That that transition, I guess, culturally is like one of the things that makes me feel really sad is like, I don't know, I'm sure you remember like that age, you kind of described it, where like talent mattered and people
Yeah.
wanted to like measure employee engagement and like
Yeah.
it felt like what you thought mattered versus, companies are kind of like clamoring to replace you at the drop of a hat. Um, Now, I'm curious from your perspective. You made a throwaway comment earlier about Anthropic and, oh, maybe things are better at Anthropic. Do you have any sense like Google in its heyday was sort of this paragon of being people driven, value driven. Are that crown seems to have fallen. That's pretty clear. Are there organizations now, that you hear people talking about that you feel are, picking up that mantle and are leading the charge there? Or is this just like really, you know, the lost idealism of the age and the world has moved on from,
I think it's
what it
maybe
used
a
to
little
be
bit the
like?
latter, but I find the Anthropic example interesting because I can't really assess the sincerity of it, but I think it's a really good marketing tool. I think that Google vacated a spot of sort of like the virtuous googly corporation. And I think that, even though, as I said, I think a lot of the kind of ideals and the kind of philosophy they were exporting was pretty sincere at the time, it also was really self-serving. And I think that, like, even the campus design, or, taking the journalists around from, Germany and France, and people would be like, this is obviously like a big plot to just keep the workers here, 24/7 and like squeeze the most out of them. And, kind of like, wow, what a cynical, skeptical kind of perspective. But of course it was powerful because it did attract an amazing group of people. And, those were some kind of glory years where, people felt really good about working there, and they did want to like, give 110%, all these things. Like those two things kind of work symbiotically. So anyway, so as I've seen kind of like some of these AI companies really use a lot of that rhetoric. I'm reading Empire of AI right now, which is such a good book, but it talks a lot about this how these companies sort of set the stakes of, humanity is at, this is everything in the world is at stake, and, the survival of the human race even, and all this. And I think that it does attract a certain kind of person that, is deeply invested in humanity, right? And like, why would a company not want people that are, tremendously, creative and brilliant? And I mean, now you see what the pay packages are for people in AI. Like clearly these companies do believe talent is really important. And so I just hear kind of from friends in tech that it's like, wow, everyone's trying to like go work at Anthropic now and all this. And I'm like, I can't assess, wow, is that a pure-hearted, like a pure-hearted, direction for the enterprise? Do they really, when the going gets tough, would they stick to those values? Or is it just a really powerful market positioning tool? It's probably a mix, right? So, and I think that, it still is a story of tech. So as I said, with, my chain of management, if they really didn't care about being perceived as, a wonderful company that really cares about people, they wouldn't put op-eds out, saying how they're, such a wonderful company, constantly reflecting on how to, be more inclusive and, all these other things, even at a time when like DEI is like kind of falling out of favor and such. but that, something in these companies, even if they're constantly threatening to replace white collar workers, something in them wants to attract and retain talent, right? So, yeah, I think I'm definitely interested to follow like some of the parallels between that early time at Google and AI, because it seems like the AI wars are sort of like heating up the way I remember like the social media wars heating up, which felt like, much less crazy stakes, because now the world seems like it's like, going to hell in a handbasket. But um, yeah, that the rhetoric seems to be really, really sweeping again. I felt like so not just changing the world, but like saving humanity is like just kind of like, wow,
Mm.
could there be a bigger stake? Bigger stakes.
There's there's an implication in something you said, though, that I find really interesting, which is that being people focused, being virtuous, like, sure, there's a world where you're doing it for its own sake and it's just because it's the right thing to do. And, sadly, I think you and I are both a bit too cynical to believe that, but that it's also just like it's good for business to be
Yeah.
focused on people, right? You can attract and retain talent, you can build a better company, you can build better products. And like, I don't know, like to me, it's just sort of with that mindset, it's just tragic that we're losing that. And it feels like if you're a good leader, you don't have to be caring about people just because, you're virtuous. It would be nice if you were, but like it is still the right business decision to do it too. And that doesn't mean like, hey, write an op-ed and like pat yourself on the back. You did it. Like actually valuing people. It just seems like
Yeah.
it's the right business thing to do.
Yeah. I think like leadership still matters. I think that's a little bit was sad coming out of and I think it could absolutely be some of the like unique complexities of Google's leadership. I think it's really hard to be a leader in a world where um the shareholder dynamics drive a lot of business decisions, where things are really complex and there's a lot of eyes on Google and all that, all those other things. But I kept waiting for leadership kind of post walkout to figure out how to like not just neutralize what the women of the company were bringing to leadership, but to like actually hear it, and I think that for whatever reason in that moment, the threat of further organizing became so existential for the company that they just had to like clamp, and that's exactly what happened with my chain of leadership, which I don't think that we're like the most amazing leaders anyway. And unfortunately, I think you end up this like self-perpetuating cycle where the people who are the best at serving the system kind of continue to get elevated instead of the people who know how to like maybe deal with the friction, kind of create stronger, more resilient cultures. Like that was the kind of what I got out of Google at the end, was like, wow, how fragile is the leadership in this culture. At one of the walkouts, TGIFs or town halls they did, one of the executives was like, went on this whole kind of like temper tantrumy rant about how the way people were talking about executives in this in the walkout and all of our comms was so discriminatory about executives. And it's not all executives who are like having improper relations, and we're really good people, and you guys are like painting this with a broad stroke. And I'm just like, yeah, this is what it means to be a leader, is like you bear a higher, it's like being a politician. Like, I mean, not that that matters to anyone, but you bear a higher standard of moral conduct. You have to absorb more. That's what you sign up for. That's why you're getting like whatever billions of dollars from your fortune from Google. That's what the money's for. And I wish to see, and I think Larry and Sergey have changed a lot over time. Like if you look at there's a leaked video from TGIF when Trump was elected, and you have Sergey, who was kind of always like sort of considered to be the sort of moral bellwether, sort of like he's a contrarian. He's just going to do what he's going to stand up for what he cares about morally, even if it's not what the board wants or something. And he says this kind of like beautiful remarks about how, how disappointed he was in the election, and how it, kind of like so deeply offended his values, but, wanted to understand, why this happened. And, it just sort of like, some of these things he holds so dear, as like an immigrant, and all these other things in the country, and as someone who cares about women or whatever, all these things. And then now he's like front row at the inauguration behind Trump, like second, and he's like a huge MAGA guy, and saying that he was totally brainwashed before and all this. And I'm just like, wow, you guys have changed a lot. I'm not gonna even ascribe a moral value to any of the statement here or there. It's just more that you guys have gotten in line with sort of like kind of the power, and that swung around a few different ways in the span of time that we're talking about. And I think it probably, I'd be really interested to understand what happens to your brain, your life, your priorities, your values as you go through such a stratospheric, wealth events and you live so much life in the public eye and all these things. I think it's really hard to stay tethered to your humanity. It's like the same advice I have, for kind of like people at any point, at any stage of organization. But yeah, it's really sad how kind of little interesting and authentic leadership I see, at least in this one company that I've been tracking and living in for so long.
Yeah. No, it's fair, and it yeah, it's its own kind of depressing to, I guess, see that abdication of value-driven leadership there.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned, Claire, as you were talking, was about leadership, like not actually hearing the concerns. As hearing was the verb there, and I'm curious, and I want to approach this a little bit delicately, but the story you lived and the story of Google here that you're telling is in some ways a very gendered story. It's the story, as you said, it's tied to Me Too. It's women who have had these experiences, sharing them, saying that's not okay, comparing notes, saying we're all having similar experiences, we're not being heard, and we're being mistreated, and there's something we need to be done that needs to be done about it, and then ultimately, not being heard and being dismissed in some way. I'm curious, and this is coming from me, and I'm a sample of one. I've talked to a handful of women who are, I think, almost exclusively ex-Google now, who in my mind are part of this sort of, resistance movement, or have had some of these experiences and have been, brave enough to speak out about it. I don't see a lot of men in that movement, and I didn't hear about a lot of men in your story. And I'm curious, what
Yeah.
role, if any,
Yeah.
what role, if any, you saw men playing or not playing, and what you see as the role of men in, I guess, conflict like this. Like how can men be
Yeah.
a force for good, and how does this not just become, oh, it's those damn women and their problems? Like, to me, this is so obviously everybody's problem, and I don't know, maybe anyway. So
Yeah, it's hard.
what?
It's hard, but I think things like with the kind of culture going as it has. I think a lot of this is sort of swung out of favor. I mean, at that time in Google, I think we were doing a lot of privilege walks and bias training and all this other stuff that was trying to get people that don't really identify as being from a marginalized group to take stock of the ways in which they've enjoyed a lot of sort of privilege in the system that we have, and maybe think about, as I said before, think about ways that they might consider spending some of their privilege to speak up for others. But I think that I with the organizing at Google, I do think that there is a tradition of male engineers who feel very strongly about the way technology is deployed. So in a way, that's personal for them, because it's like I don't want the code that I write to be used as like a weapon of war. That some of the earlier the organizing that preceded the walkout, Maven, Dragonfly, some of these other things that were about, there was a movement called Tech Won't Build It. And I do think there are quite a few people on the kind of technology side who were willing to stick their neck out, and a lot of who, as you say, like cisgender white men, right? But I do think that a lot of times when I be in organizing circles, it is women and people of color. And I think that it is it's people who can deeply relate to, empathize with, have experienced something that radicalized them in a little bit of a way. Not that doesn't mean, any one thing. I just mean that it made them feel a bit more kind of rebellious, I think, of and it made it personal for them, such that they feel like something's at stake for them, or, people that they love and all this other thing. I think that's why you sort of in the Me Too movement, you sometimes see politicians saying as a mother of, or as a father of daughters, this is personal for me or something. It's whatever it takes to make it personal for you. But it really is personal for people who've experienced discrimination in any form. I think that, part of the experience of me writing this book is in so many ways, I'm so privileged, right? So it's knowing trans people and people who have Palestinian or Lebanese family or something, who as they see the way that Google was engaging in like global conflict or engage on the trans issue. Google was very fickle about its support. YouTube, it was constantly like, we're speaking out for trans kids, and then it's like, oh no, we're not, because this is like not popular anymore, and this is like dangerous now that the administration changed, whatever. But people, I think that people who what does it take for someone to risk anything? And I think that the deep lived experience, I think, just propels people to take more of a risk. So, I think like I do urge people who feel like it's like the people who are so comfortable in the company. I think like, again, I encourage people to like try to cultivate a sense for, the morality or lack thereof of a corporation. It's the sort of like a neutral or negative, whatever. It's like these decisions that these, companies make, don't just become completely like, insulated from it, numb. It's like sometimes I feel that, this kind of extreme cynicism. Like I've, friends who are still at these tech companies are like, oh yeah, of course these companies are evil. Like, I just got to keep like collecting my paycheck and whatever. I'm like, do better. You can do better. Okay, we can like, we can try to like, stand up for others, because a lot of people around out there, who are more vulnerable, don't have the same ability to just say, I'm just going to kind of like, laugh it off. Nothing's at stake for me, even though I think these companies are evil. So, yeah, but I do think that they're, behind the scenes, as we were leaving, I would say there were a lot of great allies, and there were a lot of men who took part in the walkout. But I think when like, push came to shove, like a lot of the people that are actually really active, engaged. Oh, the other thing I will say too, just like a slightly different point, is how I think women are also really used to doing unpaid work. It's like it's like almost a cliche, but like I was really involved with my kids' school, or kids' preschool. It's like kind of a co-op preschool in our Brooklyn neighborhood, and I would just be like looking around these board meetings, and we have some great men too, but it's just like women are so used to supporting their communities and caregiving, and it's part of how we're oriented to the world. It's part of how we're conditioned. It's part of just how we like, how we expect our lives are going to be, that there's like, that it's gratifying and fulfilling. And like, I think that's what the example of being in the preschool is, that women, I think, are sometimes more able to say, I see what's in it for me, because it feels good to like, show up for my community and spend time with other people and all this. Whereas, I think that, men on the other side are like, conditioned to like think about work and be, concerned about what they're taking home and being the breadwinner, all these other things, these very kind of like gendered notions of how we structure our days and our lives. But yeah, sometimes I would like, have a male friend in these sort of volunteer positions. They're like, this is actually kind of awesome. Like, it's like being the one guy, it's like that, like, oh yeah, like I was kind of grumbling about the time commitment, but it's can be great. So, yeah, like it's just very interesting. My book too is like, when they like the cover of it, it's so like Google. It's like, and I remember saying like one of my early feedback things about it was like, can you tell this is like a woman's book? Because actually quite a bit of the book, quite a bit of points in my arc, which reckon with my unique conditioning as a woman, and how that played into how I approached my role, and how difficult I found it to fight for myself or advocate for myself, how I often fell into doing sort of like unpaid work, and women are constantly doing that. It's like, there's not like necessarily more light needs to be thrown on that, but I think that definitely plays into the sort of like dynamics of organizing as well.
No, I hadn't thought about that. And it's like, yeah, as I said, there's like a sadness to that, being like, oh, yes, of course. Like they're just willing to do more because that's what society has sort of demanded. But it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it through that. Claire, as we start to wrap up this conversation, and we've covered, quite a lot of ground, and it's been, really interesting and insightful to hear about your experience. Any sort of final thoughts, I guess, for any business or tech leaders who are listening to this and having some of the struggles or concerns that you had, or are interested in building, I guess, a better and more virtuous culture in their organization? What can they do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my dad reading the book is like, he was a small business owner, and I think he was like, kind of like had to like kind of bust the union, sort of like, the employees when they organize is always like trying to like, impede the innovation, and like, we need kind of like, unfettered, an unfettered road to just like do what we want to do, even as a small business owner selling art supplies, which is what he did. And I think that I hope that leaders and kind of like execs and managers will read the book and understand the employee perspective as well. And the kind of some of
Mm.
the challenging natures of that. I think interpersonal stuff can be really messy. It can be really hard to manage an employee who's outspoken. Um, but also there's a lot of heart in it. And I think that, like, again, it's like, to me, it's sort of like a confident leader would be able to not absorb, but would be able to hear the concerns and the fire and the anger of the walkout and transmute that into something that made the company better.
Mm.
There are so many like possible paths, and I actually, because I've never run an organization, I really don't know what those paths might have been. And I think there's like, every now and again a Google executive, I don't like, will sort of like riff on the, the complexities that make it really hard to be a leader there or whatever. I welcome that, but I think that, like, my first person account is definitely something that, is written for other people who are experiencing like the challenges of corporate life in a very chaotic world that we live in today. It's for that person, but I also hope that leaders can find lessons in it as well, because I think that dissent doesn't have to be threatening. It can kind of be like what Google used to say, which is that it is a hallmark of a healthy culture that celebrates and welcomes the insights and the accountability that employees can offer. I mean, if anything, I think we can all agree that the tech companies don't have a lot of accountability. It's a really important role that that workers can play, and that I think that managers can like try to like be a bit toughen up about. So I wonder where we're heading with the kind of like employer employee relationship, but I'm sure there will be many other iterations of it in our lifetime as tech continues to be like one of the major employers of our world, right? So, and also emperors of our lives. They're so tremendously powerful that I think it would behoove these companies to try to dig in and reflect and be better.
I think that's well said. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm cautiously optimistic, but at very least I want to be. And I can see that
Yeah.
future that you're
Yeah,
building. And yeah, I think we all kind of owe it to ourselves and our, companies to try and build that future.
definitely.
Claire, I wanted to say such a big thank you for coming on today. Really
Thanks
great
for
and
having me. It
interesting
was a pleasure.
stuff. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, look forward to reading the book.
Yeah. Bye.
Most viewers don't know this, but Digital Disruption is developed by Infotech Research Group, a leading advisor to technology leaders around the world. If that's not you, you don't need to care, so skip ahead and enjoy our content. But if you are a technology leader, Infotech helps IT teams get projects done faster, better, and at a lower cost. Infotech provides unlimited access to practical tools and expert guidance you need to execute at a fraction of the cost of traditional consulting. No matter the project, from AI strategy to cybersecurity to vendor negotiation, Infotech has you covered. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.